Hello, hello, everyone. It's
Hello.
bread and butter rye here.
What's up? It's girl Kate.
Yo, everybody. It's Chai here. And today, the plan is to continue a conversation that we started last week about how hip hop develops across borders and the authenticity of hip hop in different spaces. If y'all missed it, you made bad choices. But last week we discussed the presence of degrees of influence, emulation, and appropriation in Korean hip hop in particular. But we also touched really briefly on American and Japanese contexts as well. There's just so much to talk about with this topic, though, so we really want to expand on that today. And in order to do that, we need some background about the Japanese hip hop context. And Chai, I know that you've done a lot of research, a lot of digging, and so I would like to hear what you've learned, if you don't mind.
Yeah, don't mind. I don't mind. So there are probably some important details that I may miss. I don't know all the rappers' names who've been very foundational in the spread and formation of hip hop in Japan, but I want to give you a very simplified overview of the history so that we can understand how hip hop came to be and what hip hop means to the Japanese individuals who are engaging with the culture. So one thing that I've learned about when I'm doing my research in the history of hip hop in Japan is that there are three eras. There's the discovery era, which started in 1983 to 1994. The second era is called What is Japanese Hip Hop? And that was between the time of 1994 to 1990. And then the widening, which I think is also about pretty much the expansion of Japanese hip hop in Japan. Japanese hip hop in Japan, yeah, which started in 1999 to the present day. So the way that hip hop was brought over to Japan, which was, as I said before, in 1983, was this, I would say, like TV show called Wild Style. It was an American TV show, and basically what they were doing was like breakdancing. They were showing graffiti arts and like different elements of hip hop. And so, as you already know, because we were talking about it last episode, the four major components of hip hop is DJing / MCing, rappers, graffiti art, and then breakdancing. Right now, there's like a fifth element. I don't know when it was formulated of this fifth element, but this fifth element is actually really important. I'm going to be discussing this again later on throughout as we're talking more about like the correlation of Blackness and Japaneseness in Japanese hip hop. But the fifth element is knowledge. But that wasn't necessarily around when hip hop was brought over through, for example, the TV show Wild Style. When Japan was or Japanese artists was watching Wild Style, they understood aesthetically what was going on. They understood the breakdancing, they understood the graffiti art, they understood that in terms of like artistic form. So they mimicked that because they saw it as something that they could do because it was an art form, right? Rapping, however, again, they kind of understood it on an artistic form, but it wasn't on a conscious level. Like it wasn't like they knew why people were rapping. So they didn't really understand that kind of context. But because they understood breakdancing and graffiti art, that took more stability, or it took more grasp of the Japanese audiences or people who were watching. The first ever, I think, I'm not too sure, but from what I understood, the first ever breakdancer in Japan was Crazy A. So after watching Wild Style, he went around breakdancing on the streets, and he noticed that a lot of people weren't doing what he was doing. And so because of that, him and his friends started breakdancing all over, or creating performances all over Japan, and then they got like media attention. And that's how like breakdancing became something that was on the streets to like what you would see on TV for everybody. Then over time, well, let me stop. Before I even get into like the rapping scene, I do want to also acknowledge that, hold on, sorry. I also want to acknowledge like DJing in 1986 was also something that they started to learn. So like we have, I don't know if he was the first one, but we have somebody called Run DMC. He was a Black artist who came and did live performances in Japan. And he had a support act that was made up of like Japanese individuals. Because they were on TV, people were seeing this, and I think these individuals were doing things like emceeing. They were mimicking what Run DMC was doing. But what ends up happening is a lot of people was noticing that they weren't really good. The Japanese individuals that was on stage weren't really good. And crazy enough, from what I understood, that gave inspiration for the younger individuals to start rapping because they saw that the competition was low risk. So from like 1986 all the way until now, like you have people starting to rap. And we're going to talk a little bit about like what happened at the end of 1999. But from 1986 to 1994, you have individuals rapping because it was something that they could do and something that they saw that it wasn't necessarily like a high risk. So by the 1990s, you have different areas in Japan, particularly underground club scenes, where individuals were engaging in hip hop culture or hip hop music, just the music itself. So there was a book that I was reading, and they call it Genba. Genba is basically a site or a location where something is happening. So it could be like a crime scene or a location that has a lot of significance. There are different types of Genba. So one type of Genba is the all-night dance clubs, which is what I was saying before, where there was a lot of sites of performativity, as well as performances, actual performances of artists. And promoters were there, fans were there. And this was a space where everybody could come together and engage with each other in hip hop. So you have artists who were able to perform whatever kind of style of hip hop they wanted to perform, and you have fans who were also engaging with each other as well as with the artists about what they found enjoyable with hip hop. So Genba became a site of reproduction of hip hop, and it was localized to specific locations that had access to them. And the reason why I say that is because what was happening in Tokyo or a Tokyo all-night club could be different or similar in what was happening in clubs that were in Osaka or Nagoya. And the reason why localizing this is also important is because different cities have its own set of culture, and that was also matched in with the hip hop scenes that you will see in the nightclubs. So these sites were where essentially how hip hop developed, right? So by 1995, you end up having like an album, a hip hop album, where this gave producers who at first didn't see hip hop as something as marketable as like other genres of music, something like on the lines of like they saw hip hop now as something that they can actually profit off of. So by like 1994, this I believe is like the beginning, there was the question of what is hip hop to Japan, because as we were talking about before in the last episode, we were mentioning a lot about like authenticity, and we're questioning whether or not individuals who are participating in hip hop really understand what hip hop really is, right? Funny enough, those kind of conversations were constantly happening in the Japanese sphere when it came to hip hop. There were a lot of fans were questioning whether or not the artists that they were following or listening to are just merely imitating Black culture or Black individuals who were in hip hop, or they were producing their own version of hip hop. So conversations about what is Japanese hip hop was happening or started to happen in 1994 and 1995, since the release of an album, because producers now had a hand in the production of hip hop. Questions of authenticity. It's not that it started to happen, but it became more frequent. Those conversations became more frequent. And then there was a debate that started between Japanese hip hop artists that were on the mainstream side versus those who were underground. So the underground, because they were talking about issues of like the Japanese government and what it means to be Japanese ethnicity wise, race wise, like what is the sense of Japanesehood? Because they were questioning that in ways that the mainstream artists were not able to, there was a lot of debates of authenticities on both sides. Another other thing that's also important to note is that sampling, which is very big in the hip hop world, was not done in the mid 1990s because of the risk of lawsuits. There was a lot of lawsuits in America with sampling, and so a lot of Japanese artists and producers didn't want to mess with that because they didn't want to lose out on money. In the 2000s, hip hop by this point became something that permeated the entire culture. So you saw hip hop in films, you saw hip hop in anime, you saw hip hop in TV, videos, video games, and things like that. So it became part of the culture. So some artists were able to work with America because of the notoriety that Japanese hip hop was gaining in its own country. And then by 2003, it's not that Japanese hip hop demean in any way or decrease in any way. Like, that's not what happened. But what ends up happening is because of the hand in that producers had in the reproduction of hip hop, you had hip hop becoming more and more mainstream. Something I didn't mention before that's also very important to note is that the hip hop style that was produced in the mainstream, as I said before, was different from the underground. But the kind that they were doing, or the producers were trying to do or cultivate, was this kind of hip hop that was more pop like, that was less tied to politicalness or political views. So what they were trying to do was make hip hop more of like party like, having fun, more positivity, which again leads into the question of authenticity that the underground rappers were trying to talk about. And so like the kind of hip hop that they were making was more political. They were like, the underground rappers were talking about, as I said before, the government. And because of that, a lot of producers were trying to stay away from that. They thought it was a big no-no. There was a producer who used teenage girls in order to spread hip hop as a way to build up this image of kawaii, which is also cute in English. So this cute, lighthearted image of hip hop. I'm going to stop here because that's pretty much the biggest parts of the history or the historical understanding of hip hop in Japan and how it was developed. But yeah, there was a lot there. I also got a little distracted by my mom, but I just wanted to make sure that we have like a little bit of an understanding of what was going on. Obviously there's a lot more that I can learn, but this is from what I understood and was getting from different sources. But Kay, I know that you want to jump in.
No, I thought that was said beautifully. You really outlined the history there, and I learned a lot in what you were saying, and kind of the way that hip hop has taken shape in Japan, and why it relates to our conversation in this overall topic about authenticity of hip hop in Asia. And that just made me think about like, how is hip hop being interacted with by not only Japanese, local Japanese people, but also by international communities. Like, I was made aware about Japanese hip hop actually through Korean hip hop artists. And that's my kind of connection to that, because I was sitting here also thinking about, how did Korea gain access to hip hop, and what does that look like in Korea? And again, we can have a similar conversation about authenticity of hip hop. And I'm kind of certain that like hip hop came out of the wave of kind of like political strife in Korea in the same way that it might have done in the United States, only because of kind of the things that were happening in Korea related to these major political movements of their seeking asylum from their Japanese counterparts, those that were imperialism. And I think that's just like the powerful movement of the youth in general, and like the way that they've been able to captivate their own messages and like putting it out there. But hip hop did start from the street, right? It came from kind of figuring out ways we can mobilize the youth and using art to do so, to spread messages about gang violence, spread messages about, and then this is America. This is an American lens. So forgive me if I'm jumping from Korea to America back and forth. But from again, my own understanding of way hip hop transpired and came about is through these images, or rather narratives that were taken from the street and the youth, Black youth, particularly Black men, and how they were able to use rap as a form of release and just communicating with other young people about their struggles, about poverty, about like being misunderstood even in school or just by their family or by their communities, and having that that outlet to do so, although that's not specifically and the reason why I'm saying it's not specifically only related to just like the projections of Black culture, because the reason why I'm saying that is because based off of the chapter that was brought up here is that people have this misconception that whatever we're seeing on the TV about hip hop is solely of what Black culture is. It is only baggy clothes. It is only using profanity. It is only Black men being portrayed in a certain way and being seen as dangerous or provocative or aggressive. And those are the things that are being, how should I say? Those are the things that are being spread out on a mass platform, such as, the radio and the internet. Like, these media portrayals are what's being infiltrated into South Korea and into Japan. Although it seems like Japan has created their own way of defining or identifying what hip hop looks like through what you were mentioning about the kawaii girls. I thought that was pretty interesting. I was like, what? Like, that's what really happened in Japan. But again, like, Japan has its own way of fashioning what they want hip hop to look like in Japan, even down to the way it sounds, even down to like who's doing it. So of course you're going to see those discrepancies between what's being shown on mainstream hip hop and like what underground hip hop looks like. But from what I'm seeing taking place in Korea is that it's like a sponge. It's absorbing pretty much every element that it can and profiting off of it in that way, which is very different from the underground scene that's happening in Korea as well, where most of these artists are being identified as Korean hip hop artists and not identified as K-pop idols. There is a distinction, right? And there's no how should I say, mistake in that. And I think they made that very clear to outline those distinctions of how hip hop has its place in Korea, and it's only supposed to be contained in this way. Although we do see elements of hip hop through these Korean pop groups by having these rapper lines, but again, we can clearly tell like what is hip hop and what is not hip hop when we do listen to these K-pop tunes and such like that. But what I'm saying is that from what I've noticed in my interaction with Korean hip hop is interesting to me, because I can easily make the argument in saying that this is cultural appropriation because, one, there is no relation to this form of hip hop that's authentic to Korean identity, that's authentic to Korean culture, like baggy clothes and fades. And when I mean fades, I mean like certain hairstyles, haircuts, even down to like certain English words that are being implanted into the language, into the rap themselves. And we can have a conversation about rap in general. And I also thought what you said was very interesting, Chai, was how in the beginning there was no competition because no one knew how to actually rap. At least that's what it sounded like, if I'm being frank, is that no one knew what it meant to rap. So it comes across as inauthentic. It comes across as a money grabbing type of situation, because you notice the hype. They notice what's happening in America and how important it is and how useful it is to mobilize people. And if you want to use that as a mode to, like, I don't know, engage the youth in like Japanese culture in some way, some shape or form, then there it is. Because if you think about it, young people, they generate the most amount of money. They buy a lot of things. They consume a lot of things on the internet. They stream everything. Even when it comes down to TV, like the kids are the ones asking parents to tune the television to this show. So that gets you more ratings, right? And I know I'm like jumping from here and here and there, but whatever you're saying, well, whatever you had said, Chai, about the way that Japan has utilized hip hop for its gain, or not its gain. I don't know. Like, would they feel like they're missing out if they didn't have hip hop culture, if they didn't have, hip hop take form in Japanese culture, some form or another? I don't know. I think hip hop culture would have been just fine if it was consumed in a subculture, if it was just contained in its one entity. But I feel like over the years, past maybe 2000, people have realized, music producers, like you mentioned, Chai, they have realized the money-making capabilities behind hip-hop. And that therefore the sound has changed. Therefore, people who participate in it don't look like they were in the 80s. And I don't know. I feel like you've said a lot of things that really, it was a eureka moment for me. And I was just like, wow, like there are comparisons that I'm making between America and Japan and Korea. And I know that, Rai, you might have some more insight about the way that hip hop has taken shape in Korea. But I'm also just coming from a standpoint where, how have I personally, as a Black woman who's come from America, who have seen and participated in hip hop culture in one way or another, how have I interacted with it? And why do I call myself such a fan of this type of music when I know there are controversies behind its authenticity and its way of, I don't know, being a form of money in the market. Like, hip hop is so mainstream to the point where people are making money off of it more so than those in America who are still fighting for their place in this world. So I don't know. I'm just gonna stop there. But I think, Rai, you might have more insight that can actually inform me about my own stance in this conversation.
I mean, I feel like there are so many points that you hit on, but I'm like, okay, where do I start?
Why am I like this? I do apologize that my notes are not streamlined.
It's a beautiful thing. But I do have some context, at least, for the like Korea's history of hip hop. As far as the like popularization of hip hop sounds and rap, Sotaeji is generally considered the first one, like the first real K-pop act, but also the popularizer of, if not the first, like hip hop rap artist in Korea. Although it's a little bit contested because there was kind of like a Korean prototypical rap before that by one other person, but it was not popular. But that was in the 90s, right? And that's really when hip hop culture started in Korea. Previously, you were right about your instincts, Kay, about, how Korea's tumultuous past, right, politically, had driven generations towards certain types of self-expression. There was definitely, in the decades prior to the 90s, there was definitely generations associated with very particular forms of expression, particularly, punk, or very politically motivated forms of expression, which you would think hip hop would fit into that really nicely, right? But I guess ironically, when that kind of political era died down, that's when hip hop picked up. And it really was more of a commercial aesthetic situation. right? Because now we're entering the 90s, Korea's economy is really starting to pick up. And young people have money to spend. They can actually partake in larger amounts of consumerism than was previously possible. So there was this kind of priding yourself on these consumeristic ideals, the things that you could engage with from around the globe, in particular with Western culture, right? And so hip hop became central to that, but not without modifications, right? For instance, the clothes, yes, they may have chosen to wear baggier clothes, but they were not as baggy that would like make them stand out, because they wanted to be able to partake in a subcultural form of expression while still fitting in with the larger society, right? There's generally considered you know how diss culture is a big part of hip hop. Rappers are always writing diss tracks, and they always get lots of media attention. In Korea, that's not it's not an exception, right? Like they still do it, but there's a general understanding that if you were to write a very harsh diss of your senior, that would be wrong. That would be impolite, which is antithetical to what we do in America. We're like, because you're old, I'm going to tell you you're old, you're washed up, get out of here. But that would be inappropriate in the Korean rap scene in general. And then even the origins, Sotaeji, he implemented a lot of kind of lyrical ballad and pop and jazz elements into his form of hip hop, which became the prototype for what we now see as K-pop today, right? And in particular, like mainstream Korean hip hop has a much more lyrical, almost moody demeanor. Lots of like ballad singing as the as the chorus and so on. And there are questions about as the distance between underground hip hop in Korea and above ground hip hop, you know, mainstream hip hop has kind of closed a bit, with like big entertainment agencies like YG opening underground labels. What is truly the most authentic Korean form of hip hop? And a lot, apparently there's a disconnect between what like Korean Americans who have gone to Korea would say, for instance, like Tiger JK, who really popularized kind of Americanized hip hop. And basically he openly criticized Korean like cultivated hip hop as like not authentic. Don't know what gave him the right, but he did. And that was because he was American. I mean, I know that that's what he thinks gave him the right, but I call into these things. And then generally people born and raised in Korea tend to think of the more mainstream, moody, melodic hip hop as more authentically Korean, because it engages, I guess you would say, like Korean sensibilities, like musical sensibilities. So that disconnect definitely exists. And I'm wondering, you know, Kay, you were talking about your experience engaging with Korean hip hop, and, you know, why do you enjoy it? What aspects of it can you call out as problematic? It does make me wonder, like, do you feel a difference between the underground and the above ground? But I guess probably before that, maybe we should go. Chai, did you want to say anything?
I have been writing down like points that everybody has said, and I have like something to say about almost all of them. So, and I know that that's going to take us in a different direction. So I am fine with, like, you know, Kay, you know, you talking about your experience and, you know, think the difference in mainstream Korean hip hop versus underground hip hop. And then I can come in with, from the Japanese side, some of the points that y'all were raising and how it looks in in Japan, especially the last part. That particular point, I actually have something that I want to share with that. But Kay, you could go.
Yes. Okay, so I don't know where to start, but I think organically it comes from K-pop, right? The only way I knew about these Korean hip hop artists is through features. So sometimes some of these K idol groups will get the privilege of featuring an artist that's mostly solo. They're not in a cohort in the way that K-pop idol groups are, and they'll just sing a track. Or even sometimes too, when some of these K-pop idols do run off into their own avenues, still underneath their labels, but they're still given an opportunity to express themselves in their own genre of music. Sometimes it's not even labeled. People often mistake them as just being a K-pop idol that is just doing their own thing. And for me, as just an outsider looking in, I can say, well, maybe the work that they are doing is hip hop, because what sounds familiar to me is the 808s. What sounds familiar to me is the rhythm. What sounds familiar to me is probably the English lyrics that are inserted within the music themselves. So it started off with K-pop, me being told, okay, this is called the Rap Line group. This is, and I'm speaking specifically 17 because there's so many members and each of them have designated roles. And when I came across 17 and kind of their subunits, I was told that this is the rap line, this is the singing line, this is the visual. There are people who were present. I don't mean to say it in a very like nonchalant way, but that's basically how it came across to me. Performers, thank you. Dancers, thank you. And so with that being said, I tended to gravitate more towards the rap line, because the rap line, they seem to have elements of singing and dancing, but they were really good at this one particular skill that the other members weren't so much so with, which is just speaking fast in Korean. And I thought that was pretty cool. And to me, that was what rap was in Korea, just speaking rapidly in Korean. Until I came across like artists like Zico, and I came across Crush in Zion T. Zion T and Crush are both R&B singers in Korea, which we can have our own conversation about the way R&B has transpired in Korea, but they do work hand in hand because they're very close with the K-hip hop industry, in a way where they're kind of like outsiders of the mainstream culture of music in Korea. Like you have the ballads and you have K-pop, and those are seemingly the most popular music industries in Korea. You go to noraebangs, which are Korean karaoke places, and most of the songs on the tracks are K-pop idol songs or ballads. And you find like your American tracks for sure, but like the American hip hop rap groups or rappers that were on these track lists in noraebangs were like Nicki Minaj. Nicki Minaj, who also has like a rap for being considered as a pop rap artist. Like she lost her kudos as a rapper because she's making radio music where anyone and their mama can like, rap to a Nicki Minaj song. But that's neither here or there. I love Nicki. Don't get me wrong, but people tend to say that Nicki Minaj's her sound has transformed over the years because of her popularity. So with that being said, and my introduction to K hip hop came about was through me like looking for more, and I think that came out of also just my general interest in Korea. Like I was like, okay, K-pop is cool, I still like it, but there's investment. Like you have to like spend time with it, and you have to know your peoples and the groups, and you gotta have a bias, and you gotta do all these things, right? It just takes time and energy and effort. And then I came across K-hip-hop, where it was like, okay, I am genuinely interested in this type of music, and I don't have to prove my allegiance to it. I can just listen to it and rock with it and bop with it. And YouTube is a great place where you can just find playlists of Korean hip hop artists that was not mainstream to me. Like, I didn't know them as well as I knew the K-pop idols. I had to look for them. Some of them were SoundCloud artists where you just only find their music online for free. And, you know, you don't have to buy it per se. You know, these are just people who make music because they love the art of making music related to hip hop. But then over time too, when hip hop has become kind of the vocal point of popularity within the music industry, globally, which means that like on TikTok, you're going to hear a rap song. On Snapchat, you're going to hear a rap song. On Instagram, you're going to hear a rap song. And people are promoting their music and selling their music on these sites, the more popular it gets, right? Like, you would be sitting under a rock if you didn't know who Drake was, or if you didn't know, I'm not thinking of more like internet rappers. If you didn't know what who Armani was, right? The guy who made that thing fine as hell. Oh my God. You know the guy that, well, basically he's an American rapper, or Canadian rather. Canadian rapper. Ooh, chai. We gotta talk. No, I'm kidding. But I mean, yes, North American rapper to say the least. I'm not sure where he's from, Canada or America. Anyway, I say that to say, you started seeing more artists pop up, you know, from the underground scene to the mainstream platform, that being social media. And so I found that Korean artists are starting to emulate that, or imitate that in a way where, okay, now I have this platform, I should be able to promote my music, and so everyone can hear me. So I'm an Instagram rapper now. I'm a TikTok rapper now. I'm a so-and-so rapper, where you just see their music solely being promoted on these media platforms. And that's how I got engaged more and more into K-hip-hop. Like, even these influencers on YouTube, they were like, oh, have you heard of so-and-so? Like, people who react to K-pop idols groups are now reacting to K-hip-hop artists, are now reacting to these SoundCloud rappers, and they're getting their name out there. And I think that's how 88 Rising came about too, is that like Joji, he was known as a YouTuber. He's a Japanese American, Canadian. I don't know his full identity, but he's Japanese ethnically, and he was known as something Frank on YouTube, where he makes skits and like would rap to his skits. It's fairly provocative and, you know, over the top and dramatic, but everyone loved it. And then he's like, I'm a rapper. And so there's a whole movement behind what he's doing, 88 Rising, and it came out more artists like Rich Brian, and artists that not only like reign from Japan, but different parts of Asia, who are now a part of this cohort of rappers. And then reminded me now, Chai, of the Keith Ape, who is, I forget the full name of this whole cohort, but he's a part of something, the Walians, you may so know them as, people out there. And you might have known their like hit song Ichima, which has Ko, or rather Kohh, who's a Japanese rapper. You have Keith Ape, you have so many other artists that stem from Korea and Japan coming together, making a track, and now they have music together. So we see the purpose behind it, and we see how hip hop has transpired in Korea. It's now not only in Korea, or contained in Korea, or contained in Japan, but it's intercultural. And there are people from different parts of Asia coming together and doing this so-called thing called hip hop. And that's what I've like learned over the years, or just like been observing over the years, and I love it. I love the music because it's familiar, and I also love the languages of where the rap is coming from. And I think they do have a flow that is very familiar to me, and I think what they're doing is pretty unique in itself. But there begs the question: is it unique because, you know, because they're Asian and they're doing things outside of their ethnic stereotypes? Or do I find it powerful in the same way that I find hip hop powerful? Like, I don't view all, you know, American hip hop artists in the same light either. Like, I find that there's alternative hip hop artists. I find that there are your gangster rappers. And I listen to everything. I listen to all types of hip hop, the trap hip hop, like all the different forms of hip hop that's inspired. So should I criticize my own self for that? For my ability to say, hey, hip hop is something that everyone can participate in, no matter where they come from. It's not a racial stereotype any longer. Although I should recognize its origins, I do believe that like hip hop has a power beyond itself, being solely contained within the Black community because of its ability to allow others this artistic form to rap and talk and write lyrically about their own experiences and their own struggles. Although, before I let Chai jump in, I do have my grievances about K-hip hop that I will reserve for another time. So, Chai, take it away before I go off.
You already went off, and now I don't even know how to bring in all the other points that I wanted to bring in because we kind of like went on a different detour. Because I was going to talk about, like, for example, a lot of things that you were mentioning before, both of you actually, in terms of like emulation of hip hop, and it's not just like in terms of like rapping, like not emulating and only in terms of like rap styles and how you rap and the way you rhyme, but also in terms of fashion. And we was talking, like, I forgot how y'all said it, but what y'all was talking about in terms of like, for example, like Koreans participated in a subculture without standing out. I think Ryu was mentioning that. I put that on my notepad, but like a exclamation point, because Japan, at least from the little bit of research and understanding that I was able to cultivate, it seems the opposite, actually. Like they, or not necessarily opposite, but it seems different. Like they are emulating the styles for the purpose of standing out, for the purpose of seeming cool, for seeming down or whatever, but also to get like a jealousy aspect from other people, like have other people be jealous of them, or just be seeing, oh wow, that person is cool, I want to do that. And I forgot when that started, like I think it was like like exactly like clout, like trying to get clout. And that was definitely what was occurring, like I would say, like when hip hop was formulating, like during like the very beginning of 1990s, or the 1990s, like 1990, 1991, you have a lot, like, because like people were, break dancing and doing all these different things, you had like clothes, I don't want to say clothes, like industries, fashion industries that were like making these kind of clothes. So it was like definitely baggy, just like how Black individuals were wearing baggy clothes in their, videos. But it wasn't about like, why are they doing it? You just had like Japanese people be like, oh, I saw that on TV, I know people are doing it, let me go and buy it. And as you was talking about, Kay, people have the money to do that, right? Like they have the capacity to do that. And young adults, they just took it and they ran with it, and they were like, yeah, I'm down. And so there was a video I was watching, and you saw like everybody, wearing, regular clothes, but like typically like salary men, and then, suit and ties. And then you just have that one individual in like a oversized purple hoodie and baggy pants. And you're just like, huh? But he's just like right there, and he's like smoking a cigarette, like, yo, what's up? And like that was that, right, Nani? Like what? And that was okay. And you saw seeing that again, like in 2000s, where people were just wearing these kind of things because they think it's cool. Like it's what I was saying before. It wasn't on camera, but I was talking to other people. Like it feels like a fad, right? Like they're doing it because of like a fad aspect to it. Whereas others are like, nah, we're this is how we show respect to Black people. And the reason why I say that is because that links to other things that you all were talking about. As well as like this new like term that I found out. This is a book. So I read this book called Hip Hop in Japan by Ian Condry. I think that's how you say his last name. It's a white man who wrote about the history of hip hop. And I thought it was very informative. I don't agree with some particular parts of what he was saying, but it was really interesting on what he was talking about. And so I could give a holistic definition, but I know Ryan wants to jump in. But he gives this new term called cultural politics of affiliation. And the aspect of that, the whole idea of that, is instead of, and this is going to tackle, the self-imposing question that Kay brought up about, like, do I as an individual, like, critique myself, how I'm engaging in this, like, as a Black person, as a Black woman, critiquing myself and how I'm understanding and engaging hip hop in different ways, in different cultures. What he's basically saying is like, yeah, like, listen, like, hip hop, in order for us to understand it, we no longer can only look at it in a localized way in terms of, like, how is Japanese people using hip hop in their cultural context. But it's also not about, like, globalization. How is hip hop as a global phenomenon impacting or being seen or being emulated by other people outside of America? And the reason why he's doing this is because he wants us to de-essentialize what it means to be Black, because as we know, hip hop and Black people are interlocked together, right? It's often interlocked, which makes sense if you think about the history of hip hop. Some people say no, it's really about the 4 elements. Other people like, nah, who created the 4 elements? Black people. And why? Because of the political, feeling that Black people had when they first, well, at least Bambata, when he was like actually creating the hip hop culture, it was about Blackness and its relation to politics in America. So it's very interlocked, right? But Eon is like, yeah, but like hip hop is one aspect of Black culture. It's not Black culture. And we could talk about how, like, well, people don't see that as that. They don't really recognize that. And if you think about, like, emulation and how, like, a lot of individuals, at least in Japan, I'm going to talk about Japan because I know more about that. I don't know a lot about in South Korea, but, like, in Japan, like, who are emulating hip hop, right? Because they're saying that they're trying to respect Black people, they end up taking on stereotypes of Black people that are being reproduced out of mainstream hip hop. And so when they're looking at hip hop, and I can go back in terms of authenticity, but I don't want to, like, lose off track. But, like, for them, like, they're being authentic because they are paying respects to Black people in the manner or in the image of what they're seeing of Black people. But at the same time, if we were like, and the only way for, Japanese artists is not to be accused of cultural appropriation is using hip hop in their own cultural context, what ends up happening is that we end up further essentializing what it means to be Japanese, which is why, like, for that period of what was called what is Japanese hip hop, from the 1994 to 1999 time period, for them, it's like they were grappling with this question of what is Japaneseness and how does that relate to hip hop? What is those two going together? What are we saying as Japanese people using this art form against the standard understandings of Japaneseness? So it was really interesting. And so this cultural affiliation ideology was about de-essentializing those two things, as I've ever been repeating, while also, like, trying to move away from understanding or how should I put it? Moving away from critiquing Japanese rappers for not understanding Black culture, but instead understand how they're using the musical genre in general. Which goes in line with, because of they're trying to pay respects to Black people, instead of seeing that as a, well, you gotta learn the history, you gotta da, but seen as a way of, like, them trying to get closer to Black people, because at the time when hip hop was forming, there wasn't that many Black individuals in Japan already. And in thinking about blackface, Eon made a particular argument that blackface, for a lot of individuals who were engaging in that, it was more so about them showing appreciation. So as opposed to, like, blackface in ministry that you see here in America, where, they're doing it out of full mockery, for them in Japan, it was more of like, I want to be closer to Black people because I respect them and I love them. I'm not doing this as a mockery thing. So we could talk about qualms with that. We could be like, be like, ooh, vomit. But understanding, like, how they're for us as individuals from the outside, us understanding how they're conceptualizing this will play a big role in understanding the influence of hip hop, while also noticing the differences or the disparities of what's forming in mainstream hip hop by producers versus what's forming in the underground hip hop scene and how they can be meshed and how they're not meshed. I hope I'm making sense. There's a lot that I want to bring in because you both were saying a lot of things that I also want to touch on a lot because of the things I'm learning. But I wanted to bring in that new phrase or theory or ideology that Ian brought in because it was particularly interesting. So I'm going to stop there. I know Rai, you want to jump in, and I could come back in on something of a related point that I also want to bring in, but I got to stop because I'm talking.
I mean, Chai, I'm so glad you brought this up. This is something I've been really dwelling on this past week as we've been looking into these topics. I've been thinking about like the tendency for Western academics and people often in our positions to essentialize, over essentialize, truly, particularly East Asian cultures and sort of, right? And I've realized that also extends into music in a way that it, for instance, like I saw evidence that of this music critic as he was giving two different critiques, one of Japanese heavy metal and one of German heavy metal. And in both of these cases, the same evidence, the same kind of tropes, musical tropes, were used to give two different points. One was for Japan, it was that Japan isn't authentic enough to the culture. It's too cold and boring, and like it doesn't really get to the heart and soul and emotionality of heavy metal. But the exact same musical tropes were praised in the German metal band for making them cold and hard and so true to the authentic nature of heavy metal, right? And so I've just become increasingly aware of like the long xenophobic history of discussions of authenticity in music, right? And so I want to be very aware of that, and I don't want to be, not that I have authority in what hip hop is to begin with, but I don't want to be someone sitting here saying, "Oh, Japanese hip hop is not authentic because it's cute," you know, because you know that I guess could be an example of cultural hybridization, like we mentioned last week, and what you were talking about with the Ian Condry. And I'm just becoming increasingly aware that I need to broaden my idea of what authenticity could mean with regards to music. And if these art forms are being authentically followed in these new cultural contexts, what does that mean for the follow through as far as the history of the art is concerned, right? Like, if Japanese hip hop is authentic hip hop, does that absolve Japanese hip hop artists of knowing their hip hop history, or in particular their Black American hip hop history, right? And same with Korea. And so I don't want to over essentialize, but I also don't want to, how to say, step away from everything and be like, oh, I don't want to be a relativist either. You know, because we live in an interconnected world, and these things have consequences. But I also wanted to talk about, really briefly, the physical demarcations of like hip hop culture as they play out in Japan. And this is kind of separate, kind of related, because I was reading an article. It was a chapter of this book, Vinyl Ain't Final or something. It was a 2006 book, and one chapter of it was about Club Harlem in Tokyo, and about the in the search for authenticity, a lot of these Japanese patrons to this club, which was a hip hop club in Tokyo, as well as the artists that would be performing, would almost use like Black aesthetic as a way to authenticate themselves in the scene, right? And for a lot of them, this could have been hair related. You know, they could have dreads, fake dreads, or they could literally do like pseudo dreads with their hair. Or it could be tanning. And I didn't realize that the Japanese term for tanning, it literally translates to become black. Buraku naru. I didn't realize that. And now I'm thinking of gyaru fashion, which has kind of faded out over the years. And a lot of Japanese sub-fashions have in general, but they have often used Black aesthetics, in part because it goes against the dominant beauty standard. And like that also I see taking place in modern Korean hip hop, right? Where it's hard to, the hair, it's not hard to tell, but like the tanning and everything, I wonder if, are they truly, I would hope that it's in an attempt to, you know, legitimize the beauty of even like darker skinned Korean people, right? Because there's already that stigma there. Or to just kind of equalize the playing field just across beauty standards in the country overall. But then I also wonder if it's not that, if it's really specifically its ties to legitimizing the hip hop scene because of its ties with Blackness. But that's just me thinking out loud. You had thoughts, Chai?
No, I did. What you was talking about in terms of the self dilemma that you experienced, this was something I also experiencing, as well as I was thinking about like hip hop and its relationship to, you know, non-Black individuals, because like, you know, I don't engage in hip hop, and I you know, I talk to individuals who do, and like hearing their different opinions about like hip hop and what it actually means for Black people and what we're seeing in American hip hop right now, and you know, how are we critiquing other individuals around the world for what we would consider non-authentic attributes of hip hop, when they're just, whether or not they're mimicking. There was a lot of like questions that I also had to think about within myself as well, because like a much I don't want to say lower degree, but a similar degree is like when I think about like individuals who are not Black saying the N-word. Right? Like, do I want individuals saying the N-word? No. Why? Right? Like, why is that something offensive? Do I want individuals wearing dreads? What does that mean? You know, especially when I'm hearing the arguments all over the internet about like everybody had dreads some point in their history of being on Earth. But just like thinking about like, even if that's true, what does that mean for individuals who are in, I don't want to essentialize race, but who are in my phenotypical area who've been discriminated against for wearing dreads, or you know, the fact that we had like a natural hair movement up and down for years in order for us to love our hair, because certain periods of our time in America, our natural hair was ridiculed, right? Like I know the Black Party panthered the woman would have their hair out because it was a way of like resistance, but then that died down, and you had like people doing you know, straighten their hair and all that stuff, and then the natural hair movement came back again. This is all to add to the same I don't want to say frustration, but the same like, you know, where do I go feeling that you're experiencing, right? Because I also felt that way, as well as I'm like, yeah, tension that I'm like I've been experiencing as I'm like talking to you all, because the more I learn, the more I'm like really trying to understand why am I feeling this way without necessarily like following everybody who are Black saying like, no, this is a problem. Because I recognize the positivity in what's going on in Japanese hip hop, but I'm also like, but what about this though? And this now is the question, because Ian brings up this question that I thought was really interesting. It's like, and we were talking about it last episode, and it was, what are the obligations of individuals who participate or partake in a culture to the people who contributed to the control or the production of it? And I know, like, for example, we all three, I don't know if we agree, but I think we all in some way had said a part of this where we were like, learn the history, right? And this is where the knowledge comes in, right? The knowledge, or the fifth element of hip hop, is you got to go back and understand history. You got to go back and know why it was created, not, and as you said, right, not only in Japan, but also in America, where it was first created, right? And this is what we were talking about in BTS, in various instances on our podcast, where it's like, they go back. I don't know. I haven't seen the thing. I don't know if it was Harlem or whatever, but I didn't see the documentary. I don't know where they went. But they went somewhere in America to learn about the history of hip hop. So something like that. But it, as my friend says, it's an ongoing thing. Like, it's not just like you learn once and then you're done. It's like you got to learn the craft. You got to master the craft, and then you could consider yourself a hip hop artist or whatever, because it's something that you literally are learning. Right, California. BTS went to California, so that was really interesting to hear that from my friend, versus somebody else who was like, yeah, that doesn't necessarily matter, right? Like, that doesn't, like, what matters is, like, you just understanding the craft, and you rap it in this way, da 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 da. Eon makes a particular comparison, because he was like, there are individuals all over the world, let's say we're going to keep it to America, who eat sushi and watch anime, right? But we don't tell them that they have to read a book about Japan now because they're eating sushi and they watch anime. And I find that to be a very stupid, bad comparison. I can't speak because that's how mad I was. It was a very bad comparison, because there's a difference between engaging in, like, now just like eating something, like you eat something one time, versus like you saying you want to become a sushi master. There's a difference between you watching a show, you watching the anime, versus you wanting to make something in animation form. So making that comparison to me to hip hop was a little off, because I understand what he was trying to say, because it's like the obligations for Japanese individuals who want to engage in hip hop shouldn't be only directed to how much they know about Black struggles. I understand that, because he's trying, again, de-essentialize Japaneseness and Blackness. But at the same time, though, I feel like he missed something. He missed something very, very important with that comparison, because that comparison, like, these individuals, especially if you think about rappers, are trying to make it a way of life, whether or not it's a fad for right now. Because I'm not even talking about the audiences. I'm not talking about the fans. I'm talking about the rappers themselves, right? The rappers themselves may have a little bit more of an obligation than maybe the fans. And that's something also too, I don't know if you guys agree with, or you ladies, guys, you ladies don't want to misgender. You, my friend, like, are thinking about, like, is there more of an obligation on the rappers than there are on the fans? Because I'm thinking in that direction, but I'm not too sure. But that comparison that he made was a little problematic to me, because you can't compare, people just engaging in something one time or just eating something one time to somebody who's trying to make something a way of life and making money off of it, or making money off of it. But I don't, who's next? Because I know, Rye, you was like, ooh, when I was saying something, but I don't know if Kay, you are going to send us off right now.
I mean, we can go to Kay. I just want to say, yeah, that was a stupid argument.
I agree. I was going to add that, my little 2 cents about that too, because I was actually having a conversation with someone about how when we ridicule someone, an Asian woman who might have Black friends, and she decides, or maybe have like our closeness to Black culture just by living in similar communities with Black people, for opening up an Asian soul fusion restaurant, like, what we sit here and shame her or them for making that decision because it's something that they can relate to. It's part of her own identity. So for me to sit here and say, well, rap is not authentic in Korea because they're not Black, that would be irresponsible of me, because rap is an art form. Rap is not an ethnic marker. It is not an identity marker per se. And I think that's a huge mistake to make. But also that made me think of as well, like how untrue that statement has to be based in those contexts. Because I just think that it's, how should I say this? I want to say this correctly, but like food, like you said, Chai, it's consumable. Like you eat it, you digest it, and then that is it. And some people don't even have that like cultural signifier that like, am I being culturally insensitive by eating this food? Am I being culturally insensitive by using a chopstick versus a fork when I'm, you know, someone who's not Asian at this Asian restaurant? Like if they give me chopsticks, I'm gonna use the chopsticks. You know what I'm saying? Like it's not like I am being culturally sensitive for doing so, nor would I be culturally insensitive by asking for a fork at an Asian restaurant in America. Although people do have their qualms about that too, is that like you're not authentically participating in this culture's way of doing. However, that might be different if I was in Korea and I've been taught day in and day out how to use chopsticks properly, and yet I choose just out of my own ignorance to be like, no, like that's not what I want to do. I'm uncomfortable with that, so I will not use chopsticks. Like I don't care what anyone say. Like that's not what I'll do because I am proudly American and I can do whatever I want. You know, like having that, it's about an attitude, right? Like the attitude and the intentions you carry behind it matters. And I think it's very different to say to someone who you know doesn't see that eating ethnic food as a proper introduction to a culture, and therefore they have no other intentions to, you know, interact with this culture outside of its food. I think that's okay. Like, are we gonna crucify that person for making that decision? No, I personally wouldn't. But also going back to that self-reflection part, like, am I gonna crucify myself for liking Korean music because because I'm like alluding to something that's outside of my own cultural identity, and therefore people start saying, oh, so now you think you're somebody else because you listen to this music, now you think you're Asian because you listen to this music. And it's like, no, that's not it. Like, and I feel like people have this misconception a lot when it comes to us now living in a time where we're watching what everyone is doing. We ought to be more politically correct about the things that we're saying and be culturally sensitive, like about the things that we're saying, even down to the workplace, down to how you talk to somebody in the street. Like, it's important to be aware of these things as you are making these claims, you know. And it's disappointment in all fashion. And like you said, Chai, it's arrogance and very insensitive. And so as I say that, I want to let Chai jump in to quickly say something that's really important to us right now at this moment.
Yes, I just wanted to take the time now to give credits and thanks to my friends over at my other podcast. This is not information. So I'm going to say their names, not their full names, because, you know, can't say their full government like that. But I want to personally thank Paul, Mega, Maurice, and Kristen for all the ways in which you've helped me understand hip hop through your lens, whether implicitly or explicitly through conversations where I've eavesdropped or conversations you explicitly had with me. It's been very, very informative. I've taken some of the points and brought it over to this podcast with my co-podcasters here, where we can actually engage in hip hop, not necessarily like authentically, but really understand hip hop through lens that are not our own, especially with all of them in some form or way being, you know, hip hop heads, either because they love it, kind of similar to you both. I'm not a hip hop head like that, or have actually participate in the hip hop scene, whether in Japan or in America or in their daily lives. So I just want to say thank you so much. You've helped us to critique ourselves, as well as critique the materials that we're reading and watching, as well as giving me resources that I could share with my fellow co-podcasters. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you. Arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you.
I also appreciate you guys. I don't know y'all, but hey, y'all been...
Me too.
It's been really helpful. I mean, this is what this is all about, like taking in perspectives from other people, and building off our own ideas off of that. And I think that's really insightful. And with that message, I want to say thank you all for tuning in with us tonight, for this conversation about hip hop culture and how it's transpired in Japan and Korea, and more broadly in its relationship to American, African American culture. And we are looking forward to expanding this conversation a little bit more. Might not be the next episode, but in any way that we do kind of have our talks about like Asian culture, we try to do bring it in and make it more relevant to the things that matter to us, and what we've noticed over time, and just our own inquiries as well. And with that being said, we hope to see you all next week. Don't forget to subscribe, push that like button, hit that notification bell so you know when we are having our talk every week. And we love y'all. We love you. Also, in the comments, write some questions. Write some things down that you want us to talk about. Listen, this is not just the three of us, see? Just the three amigos. It's everyone else. And we feel it's actually quite informing if you do leave some comments down below so that we can keep this thing going, okay? But with that being said, have a lovely evening, y'all. And stay blessed, stay healthy, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.